This is a lecture on slips, engobes, terra sigillata, and how to formulate your own. So I want to start out by just talking a little bit about slips and terra sigillatas and engobes with a fun piece from my own collection. And most of this piece has glaze on it, but here's an example where, notice this is very, very dry and it's also very saturated. This is what I would call a vitreous engobe. And a vitreous engobe is like a material that behaves like a slip. It has a lot of raw clay in it, but it has enough of a melter in it so that it also gets fairly saturated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between slips, engobes, and glaze, and then move on to a couple other types of slips, and then go into sort of the nitty-gritty of designing your own slip. One word about the word slipping engobe. Slip just means any clay that has extra water in it so that it's it's fluid, you can paint with it. So slip could just be that slurry that's created when you are throwing on the wheel and you get a lot of extra clay in your water and it starts getting thick. That's slip. It's not something specially formulated for any purpose, but it actually is really nice for throwing with. But it's a very generic, general term, just kind of meaning, clay with water so that it's liquid. Engobe is a slightly more specific term referring to a recipe that has been formulated to be used for decorating. So I, always have used the word slip. I think for most of our purposes, the word engobe is more correct. But when I talk about these things, you'll find that I slip in and out using both words. So please remember, when I say slip, I should be saying engobe. All right. I'm going to pull out my trusty whiteboard and talk a little bit about the difference between a basic clay recipe, a vitreous engobe, and a basic glaze recipe. So your basic clay recipe is about 60% clay in the clay body recipe, from 10 to 30% flux. Remember, the flux is the thing that causes the clay and everything to melt together. And then 5 to 10% fillers, like grog if you want a little more grit and substance to your clay, maybe a little bit of glass former or flux. Glass former or flint if you want your glaze to not shrink as much and fuse and bond really well with your glazes. All kinds of things can go into the fillers. So then the difference, and then a glaze over here is about 70% flux, maybe 20% glass former, silica, flint. We kind of use all those words interchangeably to mean the same thing. However, when you go to the glaze lab, the ingredient that you want to be choosing is the one called flint. And it's basically ground down silica or sand to be a very fine white powder. So anyway, we have 70% flux, around 20% flint, and about 10% clay. The clay really helps keep all the materials in suspension and makes the glaze much easier to apply to the object. It also provides one of the basic ingredients that is necessary for a glaze, but that's not the subject of our talk, so we'll not go into that right now. And then in between those two are vitreous engobes. So most engobes are basically formulated like a basic clay. They have clay in them, they have flux in them, and they have a little bit of fillers, of various sorts, and they have this same or even more of a shrinkage rate as your clay, because basically you're taking your clay ingredients or some clay ingredients and adding a lot of water to make your slip fluid and paintable. So a vitreous engobe is somewhere in between a clay and a glaze, in that it has around 40% clay. These are all just generalizations. So you could easily find a vitreous engobe that has a different percentage of clay, but it should be somewhere close to 50% of the recipe. And then they have about 50% flux. So the amount of flux and the amount of clay are somewhat even, and then maybe a little bit of filler. So a vitreous engobe is going to look relatively dry, but the difference between that and a normal engobe or slip is that they have so much flux in them that the colors will become saturated even without the additional layer of glaze on top. And so that's what's going on in this piece with this very kind of rich blue here, is that it's dry looking, yet the slip coloration of blue is very, very saturated. So most slips or engobes that we make actually require the addition of a glossy, typically transparent glaze to really get the colors to flux out and have their fully saturated characteristics. So with a vitreous engobe, you don't need to add that additional layer of glaze. And so one of the really great advantages of vitreous engobes is that you can make your pieces, decorate them, and fire them all in one firing without the necessity of a second glaze firing. So if you're, say, doing a huge public project and you're firing, 50,000 tiles or something, a vitreous engobe is a very attractive choice, because not only are your colors saturated, but you only have to do one firing, and that's a lot less work and, of course, a lot less fuel consumption. All right, so let's move on to talking about slips and not talking about vitreous engobes anymore, but talking about just regular decorative slips and engobes. So slips and engobes are a liquid suspension in clay and glazes with about from 40 to 70% clay. They have flux in them, fillers, hardeners, and sometimes opacifiers if you're looking for a very, very white slip. Without glaze, the slips need to have more flux and hardeners to allow the colors to be saturated. With glaze, slips can use less colorant. So I just was talking about that. Engobes are designed for a specific function, either to be applied bone dry to your work, wet, or bisque application. And they're also designed for a specific temperature generally. So you might have a low fire flux in your slip if you're doing all low fire decorating. And if you're doing high fire decorating, you probably would have a high temperature flux. In our studio, actually, we use almost all of our slips are used at all temperatures. So they're kind of a very generalized slip. Except for one, and that is our normal black slip that we use at cone 10, cone 6. It doesn't look very black at low fire temperatures. So we have formulated a second black slip that's just to be used for low fire temperatures. And its base is not white clay, as is normal for most decorating slips, but is actually a darker red clay that allows us to start with like a darker base when we're trying to achieve a black color for that slip. So that's the only one that varies in our studio. Commercial underglazes are formulated for most temperatures and bisque applications. So that's like the Amico underglazes, Duncan underglazes. Those have, you can apply them bisque, you can apply them on leather hard, you can fire them to cone 04, you can fire them to cone 10, and they all tend to be pretty saturated and rich and able to be used at all those applications. However, I will have to say that in most times people use them at bone dry stage or at bisque stage. Generally, slips are beautiful in oxidation. A lot of times in reduction, the slip colors change, including the Amico slips or Amico underglazes, and so it's very much important to test in reduction to make sure the slips that you're thinking of using are gonna hold their color. Black slips are composed differently to utilize the darkness of some clays as a base. And so I have a chart here to show different components of a slip. So these materials, which are in your lab assignment to be found on Canvas, they show you, basically give you a chart that should allow you to design the slip that you're going to test for your lab assignment. So the first column are fluxes. They help melt the silica and to contribute to density and color response in your slip. And then and it's really simple. We're not going to use like all the variety of fluxes we have in the studio. All you want to do is, if you're going for a low fire slip, you would want to use Frit 3214 for cone 6, nepheline cyanide, and for cone 10, Custer feldspar. Now for your clay, generally we just use a light colored clay, an inexpensive clay, to help give our colored slips a good base. So those clays are likely to be EPK, Tile 6, because they're very white kaolins. You can use XX Sagar if you're going to be firing in the soda kiln and you want to have beautiful orange flashing. And you also probably want to add a little OM4 for plasticity. But since it has high shrinkage, you have to really be careful about how much you're going to use, especially if you're trying to make a slip that has a bone dry or bisque application. All right, so for your fillers, often we add glass flint to promote glaze fit and reduce the shrinkage of the slip. And then if you're trying for a bone dry or bisque wear application, you're going to really want to add what we call calcined clay or calcined kaolin. This is just like an EPK or Tile 6 kaolin clay, inexpensive, that's been fired to a high temperature already. And basically it's like pre-shrunk. It behaves mostly like clay, but it doesn't shrink the way typical clay does. And so that's going to be a really welcome addition when you're trying to make a bisqueware application for your slip. So to summarize, your fillers might be calcined kaolin, silica, flint, or quartz, which are all basically interchangeable words for the same thing. All right, so hardeners. You don't use these in clay bodies. You only use them in slip. So hardeners, you want to use them if you want your slip to be durable both before you put it in the kiln, then when you would be using a gum Arabic, or after firing if you're not using glaze on top. So you're trying to make your slip extra durable because you're not going to be making it durable with glaze. So some of those ingredients that function as hardeners are, for post-firing hardness, are flint and borax. For making your slip more durable in the application period, gum Arabic, CMC gum for hard slip and that's going to make it less dusty and prone to you touching it and then smearing your colored decoration. And then opacifiers. Opacifiers are only necessary if you want your slip to be very white. And you can use their Copax, Super Packs, any of those opacifier ingredients in the studio that end in packs. All right, so last thing I want to talk about before I make a video that's going to show you actually how to do the step-by-step instructions of making a slip. That video will actually happen in the studio. So here we have temperature range. So if you want a low fire slip, a mid-range slip, or a high fire slip. And then, do you want to apply it to the damp clay, bone dry clay, or bisqueware? And then those repeat across the different temperatures. And then the ingredients that you might be adding that I've just discussed. So kaolin EPK, ball clay, OM4, calcin kaolin, the frit 3124, nepheline cyanide for cone 6, and the high fire flux, which is feldspar. And then you might also add talc at a low temperature, and that also helps decrease shrinkage, so that's a good addition, and higher amounts when you're making a bisque application slip. Okay, what else do we have on here? Oh, the silica, which is going to harden your slip and give it enable it to fuse with your glaze. Zircopax for opacity, and borax for hardening. So basically, this is just a chart. I'm only going to look at one small part of it because it repeats. But if we're going for a low fire slip, and we want to do a damp application. Oh, this just froze up.